So today I'm going to talk a little bit about why spectrum is important. And the Deputy Director General mentioned the 2.5 to 2.69 band that is being planned for release to the operators. I want to talk about some other bands that I think are also very interesting for promoting socioeconomic development, creating jobs, and ultimately generating tax revenue for the government. So we commissioned a study late last year on the socioeconomic benefits of releasing harmonized spectrum for mobile broadband service across all of sub-Saharan Africa. And we did specific deep analysis into a few key markets. Ghana was one of them. So what did we find from our analysis, our econometric analysis of the benefit of releasing this additional harmonized spectrum for mobile broadband? Well, if we're talking about spectrum, we're talking about the 2.6 gigahertz band and the 800 megahertz band. And we're talking about releasing that spectrum by 2015. So if we assume that that spectrum is released in a harmonized way by 2015, these are the benefits that Ghana can expect by 2020. So we're talking about an additional 3.6 million mobile broadband subscribers, an additional 12 percentage points in mobile broadband penetration, an additional 1.4 billion CD in GDP in 2020, and an additional 200 million CD in additional tax revenue for the government in 2020. That's an annual number. So here, I thought this might help illustrate the point a little better. What you see here is the total number of mobile broadband connections we expect in Ghana. So what we have here in gray is the case that this additional spectrum is not made available. Okay? We can see but by 2025, about 7 million mobile broadband connections. This is mainly supported on the existing HSPA 3G deployments in 2.1 gigahertz. Now, if we're talking about a release of this 800 megahertz and 2.6 gigahertz spectrum by 2015, what we see here, this is the additional mobile broadband connections that would be realized by 2025, effectively doubling the number of mobile broadband connections in the country. And when I say mobile broadband, it's really broadband connections, because when we're talking about fixed line infrastructure versus mobile infrastructure, mobile is really the future delivery mechanism for broadband connections. Now obviously we also need fiber backbone connectivity. I think a lot of the work being done on fiber is very important. Obviously cannot have mobile broadband without fiber. How did we come to these numbers? Well, we first look at the current situation and estimate the maximum number of subscribers with the existing spectrum allocation. Then we look at, if we add this additional spectrum, how much additional broadband take-up can we stimulate? Then we assume growth in networks and traffic per user. The economic impact is calculated based on the World Bank figures showing that for every 10% increase in broadband penetration, you get a corresponding 1.38% increase in GDP. And then from those GDP estimates, we can then calculate the impact on jobs, the impact on tax revenue. Okay, GDP. So the forecast increase in broadband take-up of releasing this additional spectrum at 800 megahertz and 2.6 in a harmonized way. And I'm going to get back to the 2.6 gigahertz band, because I think when we're talking about harmonized use of the spectrum, the current plan that's been floated is not the most harmonized approach that can be taken. So if we harmonize the spectrum in 2.6 and 800, we're talking about an additional 3.5 billion per annum in CDs in 2025, which would result in over 1 million cumulative new jobs being created. Now we see here, this is the benefits start accruing immediately from 2015 in terms of additional GDP. If there's a 5-year delay, this is the additional GDP that's created. The opportunity cost is reflected here. So the benefit of not waiting until 2020, doing it by 2015, is equivalent to 2 billion CDs per year in additional GDP by 2025. And this is obviously with the delay. Tax revenue. I know tax is important to a lot of governments, especially in these times when governments face increasing pressure to raise revenue. What we're saying is, if you look just a bit longer term, and I'm going to present about tax specifically later, but releasing the spectrum, harmonized spectrum by 2015, this is the additional tax revenue that would be generated. This is the result of the delay here. So the forecast increase in GDP would create an additional 500 million in tax revenue by 2025. A 5-year delay would bring this down to about 220 million in additional tax revenue. So this is additional annual tax revenue of 280 million that you get from releasing in 2015 versus waiting to 2020. But the total tax revenue increase per year by 2025 would be about $500 million CD per year. Now, when it comes to releasing spectrum, the licenses, the terms that spectrum is released on and used are very important. Our research has shown that there are some general best practices that governments, that regulators should try to adhere to increase the investment, to increase the penetration of mobile services, and ultimately to benefit the socioeconomic development of the countries. So number one, as I've been saying in the past slides, free up spectrum to meet growing demand, reallocate underused spectrum bands. In this case, we're talking about the 700 and 800 megahertz, which is currently used for analog television. By 2015, this analog television will be migrated to digital, and those bands will be free for mobile broadband. And this is going to have a revolutionary impact on mobile broadband connectivity. And this is one thing that I think Ghana is really showing a lot of leadership in the region. Ghana is consistently ahead of other countries in terms of the planning for analog to digital transition. Also, it's important to publish a roadmap of spectrum release, planned spectrum release, so that the industry has some insight into future investment needs, and the kind of spectrum that would be made available gives it confidence to invest. Harmonized spectrum according to international agreements. Now, this is where I'd like to come back to the 2.6 gigahertz band, because from my understanding, the plan that's currently in place is to use I believe it's ITU option 3, which is more TDD arranged for the 2.6 gigahertz band. Our preference as an industry, and in this case I'm speaking for 800 mobile operators around the world, is ITU option 1, which gives you FDD from 2500 on both sides with TDD in the middle. And the reason I say this is important and this is relevant for Ghana is because this particular band plan, ITU option 1, is going to be used by countries around the world. It is one of the most truly harmonized global band plans. If we're talking about harmonization and you're talking about economies of scale, we're talking about having a $50 device connected using this ITU option 1, or we're talking about a $500 device. So the economies of scale is going to have a meaningful impact on the cost of the devices that will connect, on the ability of people to roam. If your neighboring countries go with ITU option 1, which they likely will, then there will be an inability for Ghanaians to roam with their devices into neighboring countries and use their mobile broadband networks. And it also creates issues in terms of cross-border interference if Ghana is using a particular band plan for this 2.6 and not ITU option 1, which the rest of the world will be using. It'll in effect make Ghana an island on the 2.6 gigahertz band, which is not a benefit to the operators, not a benefit to the government, and not a benefit to the consumers, because the devices will be more expensive and work only in Ghana. We support the promotion of competition to ensure consumer value. I think Ghana with 6 operators is a very healthy and competitive market. We believe that an intervention to increase competition should only occur if there is a specific market failure, and we believe that there should be a voluntary spectrum trading among operators. We believe government should enable voluntary spectrum trading among operators to maximize efficiency of spectrum use. Creating a framework that supports growth and investment, transparency in terms of spectrum licensing, predictability is, I think, one of the most important components for investors when looking at a particular market, looking at a particular spectrum band. If they're looking at an auction, they want to know that the spectrum that is acquired at auction, that the terms of the license associated with that spectrum will be predictable 5, 10, 15 years down the road. Remove licensing restrictions. In this case, I'm talking about the refarming of spectrum. So for example, 900 megahertz band in Ghana is used for GSM. The licenses that specify it should be used only for GSM create potential problems when the technology exists to deploy 3G in those particular spectrum bands. So I would urge the regulator to look at refarming the 900 megahertz band to allow for neutrality of spectrum licenses. So if operators have the spectrum in those bands to deploy 3G technology alongside with their existing 2G services, that should be encouraged, and ultimately that's going to mean more connectivity for mobile broadband. We generally support market-based methods for allocating spectrum. We think that's generally more efficient. We think license fees should not be excessive, that they should focus more on recovering administrative costs, and that the real benefit to governments comes not from collecting upfront license fees, but from the GDP and growth and jobs that are created from those additional mobile broadband connections. And we want to see fair license terms and conditions, avoid anything that's overly rigid in terms of service obligations. Consider alternative policy approaches to universal access, set license terms that allow for commercial payback. And when it comes to license renewals, we think that there should be, again, predictability here, that to create certainty and avoid a delay in network investment, you have to set out an approach, a clear approach for spectrum renewal, and establish a presumption of license renewal to encourage long-term investment and minimize the risk of service disruption to customers. Just, again, to sum up, in 2010, Wireless Intelligence estimated that there were 17 mobile connections in Ghana, about a 69% mobile penetration. We expect that number to effectively double by 2015 to 30 million mobile connections, taking the country above the 100% mark in mobile penetration. With the additional spectrum that I've been discussing, we'll have 11 million mobile broadband connections by 2020, an additional GDP per year of 1.4 billion CDs by 2020, an additional 930,000 jobs by 2020, and an additional 200 million CD in additional tax revenue per year by 2020. This is why spectrum is important. If you'll notice on your desks, especially this area right here with the participants from government, I've placed a spectrum handbook and a digital dividend toolkit. The spectrum handbook in front of you is a guide for spectrum for executive, non-technical participants from government. It gives you an idea of why spectrum is important, what the GSMA is doing on spectrum, why spectrum harmonization is especially important. The digital dividend toolkit is a compendium of case studies, of information from deployments that have already been made in Europe, looking at how the bands were cleared of analog broadcasters, how it was then repurposed and licensed for broadband. So what you have in front of you should be a useful resource to follow up on some of what we've been discussing here today. So finally, significant socioeconomic benefits from releasing the digital dividend in 2.6 in a harmonized way. A delay will be obviously very costly in terms of GDP, jobs, and taxation. And determining the right licensing approach can be critical and can enable the fastest possible implementation and adoption of mobile broadband service. And I think that's ultimately why we're all here today. So thank you again to everyone.